The dog tag pressed against her sternum felt heavier at 3 in the morning than it did during daylight. Katie Morrison kept her eyes forward as she pushed the mop across the ICU linoleum, her shoulders angled so the chain stayed hidden beneath the neckline of her scrubs. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant metallic song overhead, and the smell of antiseptic, that particular blend of bleach and something chemical that burned the back of her throat, had become her definition of home over the past 3 years at Seattle General. She had chosen this hospital for a reason. 3 years ago, when she needed to disappear, Jacksonville offered something Chicago and San Diego didn't: anonymity. A city large enough that nobody asked questions about a woman with steady hands and a limp she never explained. A hospital large enough that a nurse could become invisible. The mop bucket wheel squeaked as she moved deeper into the ICU ward. Room for 47 appeared on her left, its door standing half open. She didn't stop. She knew better than to stop. But her pace slowed just enough that the mop handle, smooth wood worn soft from 10,000 hours of hands like hers, drifted slightly off rhythm. In her peripheral vision, she could see the ventilator by the bed. Could see the endotracheal tube taped to pale lips. Could see the collapsed chest of a man who had once filled a room with his presence the way some people filled it with sound. Colonel Marcus Hayes. 3 years in a persistent vegetative state. 3 years since the IED blast in Tikrit had erased everything behind his eyes. The dog tag moved against her ribs as she resumed mopping. Not his tag. Hers. Or rather, Daniel's. Her son had carried it on a broken chain for 7 months before a roadside bomb in the same cursed city had carried him home in a flag-draped coffin. But the name engraved on the metal wasn't Daniel's. It was the name of the man in room for 47. The man Daniel had followed into hell. The man who had written her 2 letters, one apologizing for bringing Daniel into his unit, one telling her that Daniel had died saving the lives of 17 other soldiers in a single moment of clarity that seemed impossible for a 19-year-old kid from Jacksonville to achieve. She finished the ICU floor at 3:19 a.m. The hiss of the automatic doors opening and closing as she moved between wings sounded like the breath of something sleeping. She was collecting her supplies near the nurse's station when she heard the footsteps. Not the soft rubber-soled shuffles of night shift nurses. These were sharp. Purposeful. Italian leather on tile. Dr. Richard Ashford arrived for morning round 17 minutes early, which meant he had never really left. His steel-grey suit jacket hung over one arm, and his silver hair was styled with the kind of precision that required 30 minutes and a specific brand of pomade available only from a salon in the medical district. He was the kind of man whose presence made the air seem to compress slightly, the kind of doctor who had learned early that confidence could substitute for competence if you controlled the narrative loud enough. Katie had observed this phenomenon before. Not here. Years ago. In a different uniform, in a different life, she had watched officers move through combat hospitals the same way, as if they believed the space itself would reorganize around them. She kept mopping. That was the skill that mattered now. The ability to exist in a room without being noticed. The ability to move through space as if she were part of the infrastructure rather than a person. Ashford didn't glance at her. He passed within 6 feet of where she stood, his eyes already fixed on the chart in his hands, his mind already sorting through the hierarchy of his patients, the ones with families who called the hospital board, the ones with insurance companies that asked questions, the ones with minimal liability exposure. Room for 47 was likely somewhere in the middle of that calculation. A high-profile military patient whose consciousness had already been declared forfeit. A case that could be managed through protocol without making waves. She watched him enter the room without knocking. Through the small window in the door, she could see him approach the bed with the kind of efficiency that suggested ritual rather than examination. He checked the ventilator settings. Made a note on the chart. Adjusted nothing. There was a kind of mathematical coldness to his movements, the movements of a man counting down the years until a patient became a statistic rather than a responsibility. Katie had almost finished mopping when the soft sound of a monitor alarm drifted from room for 47. It wasn't urgent. Not the flat shriek of cardiac arrest or the climbing whistle of desaturating oxygen. Just a gentle reminder. A pressure alarm. The kind of thing that happened when a patient's position needed adjustment. Ashford's voice carried through the door. Get someone to turn him. And someone call his family, update them on the lack of progress. Standard protocol. We're maintaining comfort care, nothing more. She heard the assent from a nurse. Watched through the window as Ashford made a final note on the chart and turned to leave. His eyes passed over her position near the mop bucket. Registered nothing. Moved on. That was when she saw it. A subtle twitch. Just barely perceptible. An involuntary movement in Colonel Hayes's left hand, a response to the alarm, to the discomfort, to something the neurological examinations had been failing to detect because everyone had already agreed there was nothing to detect. But that wasn't the worst part. Katie had seen enough dying soldiers to know the difference between a body that had already surrendered and a body that was still fighting. She had held enough hands in field hospitals to recognize the tremor of neural activity beneath paralysis. She had spent enough hours learning the language of trauma and recovery to understand that consciousness exists on a spectrum more complex than the binary categories that filled out the medical charts. Her hands moved on their own as she secured the mop in the bucket and wheeled it back toward the cleaning supply closet. Muscle memory from a different life. From a time when her hands had held retractors in a combat hospital in Fallujah while a surgeon worked to save a lance corporal's life. From a time when she had understood that some patients couldn't tell you they were awake. Some patients couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't give any of the signals that modern medicine had decided constituted consciousness. She was 3 steps away from the supply closet when her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Emma, now 15 years old and brilliant in ways that terrified Katie on a regular basis. The message read, "Still working nights? Mom, you're going to destroy your circadian rhythm." Katie smiled at the screen, just barely, a movement around her eyes rather than her mouth. Circadian rhythm. Emma spoke like someone who had already read 3 neuroscience textbooks and dismissed the conclusions as insufficient. She had her father's relentless intelligence and her mother's stubborn refusal to accept comfortable lies. The dog tag moved as Katie bent to store the mop. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself remember what it felt like to be Major Katie Morrison instead of whoever she had become. Let herself remember the weight of 17 lives depending on her hands. Let herself remember Tikrit. Then she straightened, closed the supply closet door, and clocked out at 4:13 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for her 15-year-old Honda Civic and a single luxury sedan that undoubtedly belonged to Dr. Ashford. Rain had started falling sometime during her shift, soft rain that pattered against the asphalt like distant applause. She could smell ozone in the air, the electric precursor to a storm that hadn't quite arrived. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes before starting the engine. In that silence, she allowed herself to think about Colonel Marcus Hayes. About the way she had watched him deteriorate over 3 years from the gaps in conversations between nurses. About the way nobody had bothered to question whether a man could be awake and aware but simply unable to prove it. About the way modern medicine had decided that if you couldn't talk, you weren't there. She had seen it before. In field hospitals. In recovery wards. In the spaces between what doctors believed and what actually existed. The drive home took 16 minutes. Her apartment was a studio on the 2nd floor of a building that asked no questions and charged rent in cash. Emma was asleep on the futon, homework spread across the coffee table, her laptop still humming with the faint glow of research about neurodegenerative diseases. Katie covered her daughter with a blanket, kissed her forehead, and stood for a moment in the dark. Then she reached into her shirt and held the dog tag for the rest of the night while rain hammered against the windows and she thought about a man who was awake in a body that had learned to pretend to be sleeping. Morning rounds at Seattle General move like clockwork. Dr. Richard Ashford glides through the ICU with 5 residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark, their notepads already open, ready to document his wisdom. Katie pushes her restocking cart past the 3rd-floor nursing station, moving slowly enough to listen without appearing to listen. Her hands move through the mechanical choreography of work, restocking bandage boxes, arranging specimen collection tubes, while her attention locks on the voice echoing down the corridor. Colonel Hayes remains in a persistent vegetative state, Ashford announces, his tone carrying the weight of finality. 3 years of unconsciousness, 0 response to stimuli, 0 evidence of cognitive function. The family accepts this reality. We document stability, manage comfort measures, maintain his government contract, and move forward. Katie's fingers still over a roll of gauze. She has watched this man for 2 weeks. Watched him dismiss the involuntary microcontractions in Hayes's left eye that happen every time the 0600 alarm sounds. Watched him ignore the pattern in the patient's respiratory rate changes when staff mention tactical situations. Watched him treat a decorated commander like a billing code with a pulse. She moves closer to the doorway, her purple janitorial scrubs rendering her invisible. Ashford continues, the standard protocol is maintenance. Ventilation, nutrition, basic hygiene. Nothing that might create false hope or complicate the family's grief trajectory. Katie's jaw tightens. Field medicine trains you to read what the body says when the voice cannot. She thinks of the forward operating base in Fallujah where she spent 847 days learning to recognize the difference between coma and locked-in syndrome. She thinks of Private Martinez who hadn't blinked for 6 weeks before anyone tried acoustic bombardment therapy, sound frequencies designed to trigger the auditory cortex when nothing else works. She thinks of Hayes's eyes moving beneath those closed lids. She steps into the doorway. Doctor, may I suggest something? The residents freeze. Ashford's head turns slowly, as if compelled by some external force. His smile arrives before his words. Yes? Field stimulation protocols from forward operating bases show promise with non-responsive patients. Controlled pain response testing. Acoustic bombardment therapy at specific frequencies. The auditory cortex sometimes activates when. I'm sorry, Ashford interrupts, his voice sliding into something smooth and dangerous. Did our janitorial staff just offer a complex neurological assessment? He steps closer. The residents exchange glances. The air pressure in the room changes. What's your name, sweetheart? Katie Morrison. I'm actually a registered kitty cat, he says, cutting her off with surgical precision. His smile never wavers. Here's what we're going to do. When I require someone to offer opinions about my patient management, I'll specifically request input from our housekeeping department. Until that miraculous day arrives, you can focus on your job. The bedpans aren't going to empty themselves. The laugh that erupts from the residents is nervous, performative. Ashford has drawn a line in the floor with a single phrase, and everyone in the room understands the geometry of power. 30 seconds later, an overhead page crackles through the hospital speakers with surgical timing. Kitty cat to the supply closet. Kitty cat to the supply closet. The entire 4th floor stops moving. Keyboards pause. Conversations die mid-sentence. Katie feels the weight of 40 pairs of eyes as she walks toward the supply closet on the far end of the corridor. Ashford is already there, waiting between the shelving units with the patience of a man who has orchestrated this moment down to the second. He closes the door behind her. The space is narrow, metal shelves on both sides, boxes of saline drip stacked toward the ceiling, the antiseptic smell of chlorine and rubber tubing filling every inch. He moves close enough that his cologne invades the space. Close enough that she can see the calculation in his eyes. You questioned my treatment plan in front of my residents, he says quietly. His voice carries the lethal calm of absolute institutional power. That patient generates $4.2 million annually for this hospital through his military contract. He stays comfortable. He stays stable. He stays documented as a maintenance case. And you, he leans slightly forward, keep your theories and your field medicine fantasies to yourself. Or I will personally file a report with the state licensing board for practicing medicine without a license. I will provide witnesses. I will ensure that your nursing credentials are reviewed for competency and scope violation. Am I making myself clear? Katie takes one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from having been in rooms where clear thinking meant the difference between a body bag and a recovery room. She feels the single tear form beneath her left eye, not from sadness, but from the pressure of everything she's holding beneath the surface of her skin. She wipes it without breaking eye contact. The tear leaves a thin trail down her cheek. Colonel Hayes deserves better than a doctor who treats him like a liability to manage, she says quietly. Her voice is level. Steady. The voice of someone who has held a tourniquet while a soldier bled out and didn't let her hands shake. Ashford's expression darkens. His mouth opens. Closes. The calculation in his eyes shifts to something meaner. But she's already turning, already moving past him toward the door, already stepping back into the corridor where the fluorescent lights feel harsh and bright and endlessly cold. The humiliation spreads like ink through water over the next 2 weeks. Ashford makes certain of it. He changes her assignment from evening janitorial to overnight rotation, which means she arrives at 2,200 and works until 0600, mopping and restocking while the hospital enters its quietest hours. She hears the whispers. She sees the calculated distance people maintain when she passes. She notices that the head nurse no longer makes eye contact. But she also notices that the overnight shifts give her something unexpected: 3 hours alone in the ICU between midnight and 0300. 3 hours where she can watch Colonel Hayes in silence. 3 hours to see the patterns nobody else has bothered to look for. Then comes the parking lot conversation. It's 1,545 hours on a Tuesday during shift change. 40 arriving staff members are walking from their cars toward the entrance. Ashford is already there, standing with his hands in his white coat pockets, waiting with the patience of a man who has engineered this moment with precision. Katie is walking toward her 15-year-old Honda Civic, her bag slung over one shoulder, when he calls out to the arriving crowd, "Everyone, I wanted to make an announcement about a staffing change." The arrival's slow. Some turn. He has their attention. Nurse Katie Morrison will be transitioning to our overnight janitorial department effective immediately, he announces. His voice carries across the lot like a bell. This is due to persistent insubordination and boundary issues with physician authority. Some people, he smiles, simply don't understand their place in the hospital hierarchy. I'm sure everyone will join me in wishing her success in her new role. The silence that follows is the kind that happens when people witness something ugly and aren't sure if they're supposed to pretend not to see it. Katie doesn't stop walking. She doesn't turn. She doesn't acknowledge the eye she feels burning into her back. She reaches her car, opens the driver's side door, and pauses for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turns. The parking lot has gone almost motionless. Ashford is still standing there, surrounded by arriving staff, his satisfaction visible in a thin line of his mouth. Katie takes one measured breath. Her purple janitorial scrubs catch the late afternoon light. Her hands are steady as stone. Colonel Hayes deserves better than a doctor who treats him like a liability to manage, she says. Her voice carries across the asphalt without being raised. It's the voice of someone speaking a simple fact, like naming the color of the sky. One tear slides down her cheek. She wipes it without breaking eye contact. Her posture is perfect as she slides into her car. Perfect as she starts the engine. Perfect as she drives out of the parking lot while Ashford's face reddens and the arriving staff exchange glances they'll remember for years. 3 weeks later, Katie is mopping the ICU at 0230 on a Tuesday morning. Thunder rolls across Jacksonville like distant artillery. The storm outside the windows has been building since midnight, wind hammering the glass, rain falling hard enough that the parking lot floods in sheets. The power flickers once. Twice. The backup generators hum to life. She knows Hayes's room number by heart. She times her round so she can move past the window and see him. The colonel lies motionless on the bed, ventilator attached, monitors tracking the relentless rhythm of a body suspended between sleep and something deeper. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part arrives at 0247. The cardiac monitor alarm screams. Not the gentle warning beep. The full code blue wail that means the heart has stopped. Katie drops her mop and runs toward the room. Through the window she sees the crash team already moving, the first-year resident named Chen, the nursing staff, the rapid response team converging like cells toward an infection. Chest compressions have started. The rhythm is wrong. Too slow. Not deep enough. The defibrillator pads are on Hayes' chest. Someone is shouting orders. Someone else is drawing up medications. Katie watches from the doorway. Her hands grip the frame. In the ICU, a doctor who sees only the surface, compressions that lack the force to generate blood flow, and a patient whose distended neck veins and narrowing pulse pressure tell the story of fluid around the heart. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium is filling. The heart has no room to beat. They're pushing epinephrine. 2 milligrams. The residents are panicking. The resident Chen is trying to intubate with shaking hands. Someone says 70 seconds. Someone else says get anesthesia. Nobody is saying the word that matters. Nobody is saying thoracotomy. Katie's eyes find the crash cart. The scalpel sits there, waiting. Her purple scrubs feel thin and insubstantial as spider web. Around her neck, beneath the scrubs, the single dog tag on its broken chain sits against her skin. The dog tag that belonged to Colonel Marcus Hayes. The dog tag that her son Daniel was wearing when the convoy hit the IED in Tikrit. The dog tag she has carried for 9 years. The flatline alarm screams louder. The mop handle felt like a rifle in her hands. 2:30 in the morning, the ICU corridors empty except for the skeleton crew, and Katie had timed her janitorial rounds deliberately, waiting for the shift change when the night nurses clustered at the station reviewing charts, when she could walk past Colonel Marcus Hayes' room without drawing attention. The storm outside hammered the windows like someone demanding entry, and the power flickered once, twice, the backup generators humming to life with a low mechanical growl that made the fluorescent panels strobe. She was on the 3rd floor, pushing her cart past the isolation rooms, when she heard it. The monitor. A sound her hands remembered before her mind could process the meaning. Not the steady beep-beep-beep of a stable rhythm, but the rapid-fire staccato of a heart rate climbing past 140, 160, 180. The sound of cardiac distress. The sound of a body beginning to fail. Katie's spine went straight. Her hand stilled on the mop handle. That sound had a gravity well, pulling her toward room 312 even as the rational part of her brain, the part that had spent 3 weeks mopping floors and accepting humiliation, screamed that she should keep walking. She didn't keep walking. The code team arrived before she reached the room, 2 nurses and a resident moving with the careful efficiency of people who had answered this call 50 times before. Katie pushed through the doorway behind them, her janitorial uniform making her invisible, making her just another hospital body in the margins. What she saw made her breathing shallow. Colonel Marcus Hayes lay on his back, his chest heaving in the irregular gasps of a man whose heart was betraying him. The on-call resident, a kid, couldn't have been past his 1st year of fellowship, hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the intubation equipment, kept missing the vocal cords, the endotracheal tube sliding past the target again and again. A nurse named Chen was performing chest compressions, but the compressions were too shallow, the rhythm off, lacking the violence that cardiac arrest demanded. The monitor showed the electrical storm of ventricular fibrillation. "Stop compressions," the resident said, voice cracking. "I need to get the airway." Katie watched the tube miss again. A line going nowhere. Central line kit still unopened on the bedside tray. Ashford wasn't here. Nobody with authority was here. Just a kid with shaking hands and a dying man whose chest was rising and falling with the broken rhythm of failure. The dog tag she had carried for 9 years, Marcus Hayes' tag, pressed against her palm in the supply closet 3 days ago, seemed to burn against her skin. Katie dropped the mop. The handle clattered against the tile like a weapon being drawn, and when she moved toward the bed, every person in that room turned toward her. "Stop compressions," she said. Not a question. A command. The voice that emerged was not the deferential whisper of a janitor or the careful politeness of a nurse questioning her superior. It was the voice of someone who had stood in trauma bays in Tikrit while rounds hit walls and medics screamed for O-positive and soldiers with missing limbs begged for morphine. The residents and nurses didn't move. "Do it now," Katie said. The air pressure in the room shifted. Chen dropped away from the compressions. Katie moved to Hayes' side, her hands moving through the pre-procedure assessment with the economy of motion that came from doing something 374 times. Her fingers found the landmarks, the fourth and fifth intercostal space, the midclavicular line, as though her body had been waiting for permission to remember. "Chen, bag him manually, every 4 seconds. Rodriguez, get me a 14-gauge needle and prep his chest with chlorhexidine. You," pointing at the resident still holding the useless intubation equipment, "step back." Nobody breathed. Katie grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart, didn't bother with a full sterile field because there was no time for sterile, there was only dying and not dying. She prepped Hayes' chest in 4 seconds, the smell of antiseptic sharp and clean. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook. She'd done this in a Humvee under fire. She'd done this in a bunker with incoming rounds walking closer. She could do this in an air-conditioned hospital room in Jacksonville, Florida. The incision was clean. For centimeters, through the skin and subcutaneous tissue and into the fourth intercostal space. Blood welled, dark and immediate, and Katie's fingers followed the path of the blade, finding the pericardium by feel, by knowledge written into her muscle memory in a field hospital 15 years ago where she had saved 37 lives before shrapnel tore through her shoulder and ended Major Katie Morrison's medical career in the military. Her fingers breached the pericardium, felt the fluid compressing Hayes' heart like a fist slowly closing. "There," she whispered, and her voice was steady as a surgical laser. She drained the tamponade with 2 careful movements, blood flowing, and on the monitor above Hayes' bed, the electrical chaos began to slow. The rhythm shifted. The chaotic fibrillation smoothed into something resembling order. "Sinus rhythm," Rodriguez breathed. Katie's fingers felt for a pulse in Hayes' groin, felt the femoral artery jump under her touch, felt the blood moving again, felt the impossible transition from dying to living. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, blood loss at this rate, need 2 units of O-negative running, need the on-call surgeon, need a proper OR before this containment became catastrophic, when she heard the elevator doors slide open down the hallway. Footsteps. Fast. Angry. Dr. Richard Ashford appeared in the doorway still buttoning his shirt, his face still creased with sleep wrinkles, and his eyes moved from Hayes' chest to Katie's hands and the understanding that bloomed across his face was slow and terrible and complete. He stared. His jaw moved. No words came. Katie continued closing the incision, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done this in circumstances where hesitation meant death. Silk sutures, interrupted stitches, each one a tiny knot that held flesh together. She didn't look at Ashford. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She simply closed the wound that she had opened to save a life that he had given up on 3 years ago. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like it was trying to warn someone. "Who authorized this procedure?" Ashford's voice came out as a whisper that carried more threat than a shout. Katie stripped off her gloves. 1. 2. Snapped them into the biohazard container without making eye contact. "He was dying, doctor. I saved him." "You just ended your career," Ashford said. Not angry. That was what made it worse. He said it like a fact. Like something already written and sealed. He turned to the resident. "You are a witness to this." "Dr." He glanced at the name badge. "Paulson, you witnessed an unlicensed individual performing surgical intervention without authorization or credentials. Is that correct?" The resident's face had gone white. He nodded. "Chen. Rodriguez. Did either of you attempt to stop this procedure?" They didn't answer. Ashford pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway, and Katie heard his voice, calm, measured, dangerous, beginning the first call. "Yes, hello, this is Dr. Richard Ashford, Chief of Neurology at Seattle General. I need to report an incident of practicing medicine without a license. No, not a resident. A nursing staff member. Yes. I'll hold. The second call came 20 minutes later, once Hayes had been moved upstairs, once the attending surgeon had arrived and assessed the procedure with a low whistle of professional respect that meant nothing because the decision had already been made. This is Dr. Ashford calling the hospital CEO. We have a significant liability exposure. Yes, tonight. A staff member performed an unauthorized thoracotomy. No, I won't say her name over the phone. The third call came as Katie was changing out of her soaked scrubs in the locker room. Security. I need credentials pulled for Catherine Morrison immediately. Janitorial staff. She's in the hospital now. Yes, I'll press charges. The fourth call, the one that sealed it, came at 5 in the morning, while Katie sat in the HR office with her cardboard box already packed, the one to Ashford's friend at the State Nursing Oversight Committee. She watched him through the glass partition, watched his face as he listened, watched him nod, watched him say, I know. Yes. Absolutely. She claimed she was trying to help. Yes. I agree. We can't have nurses thinking they're surgeons. By 6 o'clock, she was sitting in the HR office across from Ashford and a woman named Patricia Reeves who had the exhausted expression of someone who had been woken up at 4 in the morning to fire someone. The termination is effective immediately, Patricia said, sliding a letter across the desk with the tone of someone reading from a script. Gross violation of scope of practice. Practicing medicine without a license. Unauthorized surgical intervention. The hospital is not pressing criminal charges at this time, but the state board and licensing will be notified. Katie looked at the letter. Looked at Ashford. His face was smooth, controlled, satisfied in a way that made her understand that this was what he had wanted all along, not just to diminish her, but to erase her. To prove that she had never been anything but a janitor playing at authority. Security will escort you out, Ashford said. You have until 6:30 to remove your personal items. Katie stood. She walked to her locker. She placed the faded photograph of Daniel in his dress uniform into the cardboard box, placed the dying succulent in next, placed the chipped coffee mug that said World's Okayest Nurse carefully on top. She reached into her scrub pocket and felt the dog tag, Marcus Hayes's dog tag, the one Daniel had been carrying when he came home in a flag-draped coffin, and for one moment, standing alone in the empty locker room, her hand closed around it hard enough that the edges bit into her palm. She walked out into the rain at 6:27. The parking lot was empty at this hour. Storm clouds still low and angry overhead, rain coming down so hard it sounded like static. Katie stood under the awning with her cardboard box held against her chest, rain hammering the asphalt around her, and for exactly 3 seconds she didn't move. Didn't think. Just breathed and held the weight of the box and understood that Richard Ashford had just taken the only thing she had left, a place where she was useful, where she was needed, where she could do something that mattered. She took a measured breath. A single tear escaped, and she wiped it without breaking her own gaze, meeting herself in the glass reflection of the hospital door. The composure was still there. The straightness of her spine. The steady hands. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Marcus Hayes might wake up to find that the person who saved him had been erased, that the procedure that gave him a second chance had cost her everything, that the dog tag she had carried for 9 years was still pressing against her palm and nobody in this hospital would ever know why it mattered, what it meant, whose blood had soaked into it first. She turned away from the glass. She walked toward the bus stop in the rain, past Ashford's car in the VIP parking section, a black BMW, license plate Neuro 1, and she didn't look back because looking back was a luxury that people with choices had. Katie didn't have choices anymore. She had a cardboard box and a dog tag and the knowledge that the colonel she had just saved would probably never know her name. The 4 phone calls took exactly 17 minutes. Dr. Richard Ashford stood in his office on the 7th floor while Katie was still in the ICU, still washing Colonel Hayes's blood from under her fingernails, and he dialed with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years learning which doors opened for people like him. The licensing board picked up on the second ring. He spoke for 3 minutes about unauthorized surgical procedures, scope of practice violations, immediate danger to patients. His voice stayed calm. Professional. Concerned. The kind of concern that made administrators nervous. The hospital CEO took the call personally. Ashford detailed the liability exposure, a nurse performing thoracotomy without physician oversight, the potential for lawsuits, the insurance implications, the media risk if word got out that Seattle General employed unlicensed surgeons masquerading as janitorial staff. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Fear did the work for him. Security was next. A simple message, credential access revoked, effective immediately. The kind of message that meant Katie's badge would be deactivated before she finished her paperwork. The fourth call went to his friend Marcus Chen at the State Nursing Oversight Committee, the one who owed him a favor from a consulting contract 3 years ago, the one who understood how these things worked in the real world, where credentials and reputations mattered more than whatever the hell had just happened in Trauma Bay 3. 23 seconds. That's all it took. By the time Katie pushed through the ICU doors, her nursing license was flagged for immediate review. Ashford descended to the 3rd floor at 06 for 7 hours. He didn't hurry. Hurrying suggested panic, and he never panicked. He found Katie in HR, already sitting across from Linda Vasquez, the administrator with the clipboard and the sympathetic expression she'd been trained to perfect over 8 years of terminations. Ashford entered without knocking. Nodded to Linda. Sat down across from Katie like he was settling into a chair at his country club. Major Morrison, he said, and Katie's shoulders tensed at the word, the first time he'd used her rank in months, maybe years, a deliberate provocation designed to remind her that he knew, that he'd known all along, that her secret had never been as safe as she'd believed. I'm afraid we have a serious situation. Katie didn't move. Her hands rested on the table, steady as surgical instruments. Her eyes remained fixed on the wall behind him. Linda cleared her throat. Ms. Morrison, we've received multiple reports regarding your conduct this morning. Specifically, allegations of practicing medicine without a license, performing surgical procedures outside your scope of practice as a custodial employee, and endangering patient safety through unauthorized interventions. The word custodial hung in the air like a blade. The hospital's legal team has advised that we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately, Linda continued, her voice sliding into the practiced rhythm of someone reading from a script she'd read 100 times before. This decision is final and not subject to appeal. You'll surrender your credentials, your access badge, and any hospital property in your possession. Security will escort you from the building. Katie stood. Her chair made no sound against the tile floor. She turned to face Ashford directly for the first time since entering the room, and something in her expression made him shift slightly in his seat, not fear, not submission, but the kind of absolute stillness that came from someone who had already calculated 17 different ways this conversation could end, and had decided none of them mattered. The Colonel, she asked. Is stable, Ashford said. Thanks to the medical team's rapid response. That's not what I asked. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Katie turned back to Linda, nodded once, and walked out without another word. No argument. No anger. No tears. Just the sound of her footsteps on the tile, moving toward the exit like a soldier walking away from a war that had already decided her fate. The rain started before she reached the parking lot. Not a drizzle, a hammering downpour that sounded like applause, like the sky was celebrating something, or mourning it. Katie didn't run. She walked to the HR office, collected the cardboard box Linda had prepared. Protocol required that terminated employees be given time to gather personal items, and moved through the hallway she'd walked 1,000 times before. Her locker was on the 2nd floor, in the staff break room where she'd spent most of her 3 years at Seattle General, not speaking, not making eye contact, not existing in any way that would draw attention. She opened it now and looked at the small succulent on the shelf, the one Emma had given her 6 months ago, the one she'd been slowly killing with neglect because even plants required more attention than her life could spare. The soil was bone dry. Cracks ran through the ceramic pot like fault lines. She wrapped it in newspaper, the same newspaper from last Tuesday's break room table, and placed it in the box. The coffee mug came next. "World's okayest nurse," it said in fading white letters on a chipped ceramic surface. She'd bought it at a drugstore after her first week, when she'd still believed that humor could coexist with grief, that naming the pain might make it manageable. The crack ran from the rim down through the bowl, held together only by muscle memory and the unwillingness to let go. The photo of Daniel was last. 19 years old, dress blues, that smile that had died in Tikrit along with everything else that mattered. She placed it carefully on top of the mug, tissue paper between them so the glass wouldn't crack further. And then, from the inside pocket of her scrubs, the pocket she'd worn against her ribs for 3 years, she removed the dog tag. Marcus Hayes's tag. The one Daniel had been carrying when the IED detonated, the one the casualty officer had returned with his personal effects, the one Katie had kept pressed against her skin like a talisman or a wound that refused to heal. The rain hammered the street as she walked out of Seattle General at 0652 hours. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from the gravity of what it contained, the life she'd built on top of a lie, the purpose she'd constructed from grief and obligation, and the stubborn refusal to let go of a son who had been gone for 8 years. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, across the street from the hospital, positioned so that anyone sitting there could watch the entrance for eternity if they wanted to. Katie sat on the wet bench and pressed the dog tag into her palm until the edges cut into her skin. The chain had broken years ago. Now it was just the metal rectangle, just the name and rank and service number of a man who had sent her son into a war and sent him back in a flag-draped box. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The rain soaked through her scrubs. Her hair plastered itself to her face. A city bus drove past without stopping because she hadn't signaled, hadn't moved, hadn't indicated in any way that she was waiting to be rescued from anything. That's when Emma appeared. The girl burst through the rain like she'd been shot out of a cannon, backpack open, 14 years old and moving with the kind of desperate urgency that only teenagers could access when they decided something mattered more than breath. She was soaked through. Her backpack hung open, dripping. "Mom," Emma gasped, dropping onto the bench beside her. "They need to see these." Katie turned slowly. Rainwater dripped from her chin. Emma pulled out a shadow box. The one Katie kept in the attic, buried under Christmas decorations and winter clothes and all the things she'd been trying to bury for the last 8 years. Inside were medals. Bronze stars. A silver star. Purple hearts. The physical evidence of a life she'd spent 3 years erasing. "Emma, no," Katie said, and for the first time that morning, her voice cracked slightly. "You need to put that back." "You saved someone's life," Emma said, her own voice shaking but certain in a way that only children could be certain about things. "And they fired you. They need to know who you are." Katie looked at her daughter's face, Daniel's face, really, the shape of his jaw and the stubborn set of his chin, the same expression he'd worn when he'd announced he was enlisting, and Katie had known there was no argument in the world that would stop him. "I don't want them to know, baby. I'm not that person anymore." But Emma was already pulling out her phone, already dialing, already moving toward the hospital entrance like she was walking toward something Katie had spent years running from. Within 47 minutes, Katie found herself standing in the hospital's executive conference room on the 5th floor, water still dripping from her clothes, the dog tag cold against her palm. The board members sat around a table that probably cost more than her annual salary. Dr. Ashford stood at the head, mid-presentation about risk management protocols and liability exposure and why decisions, once made, should not be questioned by people who didn't understand the complexity of administration. Emma stood in the doorway holding the shadow box like it was evidence in a trial, which Katie supposed it was. Everything that happened next moved in slow motion, the way trauma does, a series of moments that seemed to last hours even though the clock said seconds were passing. Within the hour, the hospital's executive board reconvened in the 7th floor conference room, the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel small. Katie sat in the back row, still wearing her janitorial uniform, the smell of bleach lingering on her hands. Emma stood in front of the mahogany table, the shadow box trembling slightly as she held it. "My mother," Emma said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "is Major Katie Morrison." The silence was absolute. Superintendent Patricia Chen leaned forward. "I'm sorry, what did you?" Emma opened the shadow box. Medals caught the fluorescent light. Bronze star. Silver star. Purple hearts. The room seemed to contract around those ribbons. Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. Her daughter was doing what she could never do, speaking the truth out loud in front of people who had the power to destroy her. A pediatric nurse named Sullivan stood from his seat. He'd served in the Navy, Katie knew that much, but they'd never spoken about it beyond a nod in the hallway. Sullivan's hands shook as he pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I called Naval Records," Sullivan said, his voice rough. "I needed to verify something." Katie Morrison. Commission 2007. 3 combat deployments, Tikrit, 2009 to 2010. Fallujah, 2010 to 2011. And Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2012 to 2013. Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, 2010. Silver Star for Extraordinary Heroism, 2011. Sullivan looked directly at Dr. Ashford. "She also has 2 Purple Hearts. But the file says 3 total. Where's the third one?" Katie's jaw tightened. The third one. The shrapnel that took her shoulder. The infection that almost took her life. The disability discharge that came 3 months later. The conference room doors burst open. A man in a wheelchair rolled through, navy dress blues immaculate, face weathered like old leather. Commander James Park. His presence made the air pressure change, made everyone sit straighter without knowing why. "I'm SEAL Commander James Park," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. "Retired. 12 years ago, Major Morrison saved my life when my convoy was ambushed outside FOB Shank. That was before the shrapnel. Before she learned to walk again. And before she pushed a mop around this hospital for 3 years while you people acted like she was nobody." Park's hand gripped the wheelchair arm. "She has 2 bronze stars. 1 silver star. 3 purple hearts. And the gratitude of men who would follow her into hell if she asked them to." Ashford started to speak. Park cut him off with a gesture that required no words. "Don't," Park said quietly. "Just don't." 2 days passed. Katie reported to her new office on the 3rd floor, temporary, pending the board's final decision, and tried not to think about the television playing in the break room. The evening news anchor Diane Wu was interviewing someone in the studio, and Katie's hand froze on her coffee cup when she recognized the silhouette. Dr. Ashford. In his suit. His careful smile. That smile that had humiliated her in front of 12 nurses and 3 residents. On the television, Ashford leaned toward Wu with the posture of a man who'd rehearsed every word. "I want to address the Katie Morrison situation," he said, his tone suggesting concern for a troubled employee. "This is an unstable individual with delusions of military service. She violated protocol repeatedly. She endangered patients with unauthorized procedures. She's dangerous, and frankly, I'm concerned about her psychological stability." Katie set down her coffee. Didn't spill it. Didn't break the cup. Her hands, the ones that had held 73 lives together in field hospitals across 2 continents, remained steady. Wu nodded, making notes. "Doctor, I understand you're concerned about." Wu's earpiece crackled. Her eyes widened slightly. She touched her ear, listening. "Dr. Ashford," Wu said, her voice shifting into something sharper, "we have a call from General Patricia Vance at CENTCOM. She says she has information about this case." Ashford's smile froze. A muscle twitched at the corner of his jaw. "I'm sure the General is just." General Vance's voice came through the studio speakers, broadcast to 2 million Jacksonville viewers. The voice was older, tempered by decades of command decisions that cost lives. Dr. Ashford falsified his military consultant credentials, Vance said flatly. He claimed to have served as a Navy medical officer specializing in combat trauma. He never served. He purchased credentials from a deceased physician's estate and used them to secure employment and billing privileges with the VA. This has been under investigation for 6 months. The camera caught Ashford's face draining of color. Not red. Not animated. Just the terrible paleness of a man watching his architecture crumble in real time. Those are administrative, Ashford's voice cracked. His hand fumbled for the microphone. That was an oversight. We've recovered email evidence, Vance continued, her tone never wavering. Falsified discharge papers. Fabricated medical board certifications. He's been billing the Department of Veterans Affairs for specialized consultations he's not qualified to provide. He's received approximately $247,000 in fraudulent payments over the past 4 years. Wu leaned forward. Doctor, is this true? Ashford stood. His chair scraped backward. The sound echoed through the studio. He ripped off his microphone, the cord tore from the pack at his belt, and walked off set while the cameras rolled, capturing every frame of his retreat. Wu didn't try to stop him. The anchor just sat there, jaw slightly open, as the silence expanded to fill the entire broadcast. By morning, the clip had circulated through social media 847,000 times. News outlets in 12 cities picked it up. The medical board suspended Ashford's license pending criminal investigation. His wife filed for divorce through her attorney. The hospital issued a statement terminating him immediately and voiding all consulting contracts dating back to 2019. Ashford's professional profile disappeared from LinkedIn. His office was cleared by hospital security and his access badges were deactivated. Within 72 hours, he became a cautionary tale, the meme that played whenever someone mentioned lies on a resume, his frozen face on camera becoming shorthand for getting caught, for the moment everything fell apart on live television. Katie didn't watch the news. She didn't need to. Commander Park sent her a screenshot with 2 words, "He's finished." She kept it for approximately 4 minutes before deleting it. She didn't need a memorial to Ashford's collapse. She had something else to do. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.